Blast Wall with Lisa Traxler. This podcast was supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. I will be talking about my solo art exhibition, Blast Wall, exploring the notion of home and my relationship to my own distinctive home, a decommissioned World War II radar bunker. I'm standing in the blast wall area of a World War II radar bunker on the Isle of Wight. My name is Lisa Traxler, and I would like to take you on a walking tour of my latest art exhibition. The building here is one of the decommissioned chain home radar stations built by the Royal Air Force that lined the coast of Britain during the Second World War, detecting and tracking enemy aircraft. I've been researching the history of this radar bunker for a number of years, but it was during the pandemic lockdowns of 20 and into 21 that my time spent here became very important. The site where the radar bunker is situated is also my home. Several years ago, my partner and I bought this plot of land on the south coast of the island in order to build a new home. It's situated above the ragged coastline on a flat plateau with views to the sea, yet it's sheltered by a formation of towering rocks known as the Undercliff. The landscape is wild and beautiful. I'm a visual artist. My studio is here on site, and it would have been part of the soldiers' barracks. It's a craft hut, a 7-sided building that bolts together. It's similar in style to the more well-known Nissen hut, built for purpose during the Second World War. Quietened by the noise of outside, during the strange time of lockdown, gave me time and space to explore my art practice. This experimentation time created new ways of bringing the 2- and the 3-dimensional aspects of my art together. I work across the disciplines of sculpture and painting. To give you an idea about where I'm standing, the blast wall is a cast concrete structure, 10 metres by 3.5 metres wide, with thick 4-metre high walls surrounding a rectangular space, almost like a courtyard, open to the sky and the elements. It's located on the seaward side, protecting the area of the building that would have housed the generator. The concrete is mottled and weathered. Within its form is embedded a grid of steel rods. It would have been cast in place within a wooden formwork, leaving a textured imprint, an evocative memory of its handmade past. There are concrete triangular-shaped protected entrances either end, giving a view through the courtyard area to the land beyond. A blast wall is a barrier designed to protect vulnerable buildings or other structures and the people inside them from the effects of nearby explosion caused by industrial accident, military action, or terrorism. On those days when it felt like the world had stopped, I would stand within this place, watching the sun cast geometric shadows across the concrete walls. Time was measured by these creeping shapes within this stillness. This place felt safe and secure. It is my home. The British painter Paul Nash talks of this sense of place that home brings. His family home was important to his emerging concept of place. He wrote, "It was undoubtedly the first place which expressed for me something more than its natural features seemed to contain, something which the ancients spoke of as genius loci. The spirit of a place. Its magic lay within itself, implicated in its own design and its relationship to its surroundings. With this sense of magic about this place, I set about considering how this piece of architectural defence history could be translated with my art. I had spent much time at the Imperial War Museum in London, immersing myself in the history that surrounds this radar bunker. I'm outside the Imperial War Museum in London. It's still closed due to the lockdown rules, but I wanted to continue here as this became an important place for me to visit in the past whilst carrying out research. One of the interesting events during lockdown was the rediscovery by my family of a collection of military letters written by my great-uncle, a lance corporal posted overseas during the Second World War. He wrote frequently to his sister about his yearning for home, missing not only his loved ones, but also the domesticity of everyday existence. Each time he wrote the word home, he used a capital H, elevating this word to describe the spirit of place, his genius loci. This collection of letters gave me the emotional history of this period of time, set alongside the bunker's historical defence architecture. Sitting here outside the museum, knowing that within that building, the memories and stories from ordinary people living through the strange and frightening time of war have been collected and saved to recount to others. We can almost compare parallels to now: blackout rules and lockdown regulations, and perhaps the idea of keeping up morale and community spirit. Through all of this, our homes have become our place of safety. I'm going to walk on to the Foundry Gallery now, where the work I made during lockdown for the exhibition Blast Wall has been installed. The gallery is situated in Old Church Street in Chelsea, so from here at the museum, I'll take a route along Lambeth Road, across Lambeth Bridge, and through an area called Churchill Gardens before arriving at the gallery. Churchill Gardens is a large housing estate in the Pimlico area of Westminster in London. The estate was developed between 1946 and 1962 to a design by the architects Powell and Moyer. It replaced Victorian terraced houses that had been badly damaged during the Blitz. After the end of World War II, London was in desperate need of housing. The Blitz during 1940 and into 1941 was an intense bombing campaign. For 8 months, bombs were dropped on London and other main cities across Britain. Around 2 million homes were destroyed during this war, and 2.25 million people were made homeless. Many people moved out of London to what was known as the new towns being built. Back in London, the first 10-storey council housing blocks were being constructed. This acute housing shortage needed a high-density housing solution. Churchill Gardens was a response to that problem, and it was one of the first post-war estates to adopt modernist planning principles, influenced by the architect Le Corbusier, building high and within areas that were both green and filled with light. I wanted to find out more, so earlier I chatted to Jonathan Goode, architect and historic building specialist at Lelay Architects, about post-war living and housing, and the places we called home after so much destruction during the war. So Jonathan, I'm just quite interested in post-World War II, after the Blitz, after all this destruction and devastation. There was a housing shortage, but how did we resolve this crisis? It just seems enormous, doesn't it, to imagine how we can operate and make something work after such a devastation.
Yes, I mean, it was a terrible time in terms of housing need. I mean, there was great devastation in terms of housing, a lot of housing of very poor condition, a lot of overcrowding, and a lot of people returning from the war that needed to be housed.
And I guess displacement, wasn't it? People that have been bombed out and were living with family or other relatives.
That's right. So you've probably got a lot of situations where people are living in multiple families living in one house, for example. So there's a need to sort of find them proper space.
I think this idea then of home then, so your home, which is such an important space to you and as a place of safety, had literally been blown away from you. It was just sort of this catastrophe. So I guess then when this sort of crisis was happening. I've got something here. I want to read it out. It's actually from Architectural Review, and it's talking about the modernist desire expressed by Le Corbusier was to provide an environment that was spiritually fulfilling, creating harmony between people and their surroundings, and freeing communities from the misery of poor housing. That sounds like a wonderful idea. So how did this translate into a building? I mean, what would we be looking at from Le Corbusier or this modernist architecture?
I think architects at the time, I think they clearly believed that housing could be much better. That in a way, that there was a very positive aspect to housing, and particularly sort of modern housing and housing coming out of the modernist traditions. And a lot of this was linked to ideas in terms of what we might consider nowadays in terms of well-being. So people would have their own home, have to be sharing them with other people. That ideas of light and fresh air were crucial in these
almost ways. We take this for granted now.
Yeah, things we take for granted, and space. Having landscape, having views, not feeling compressed and in poor quality housing. I guess where you're living on top of other people. The idea is to give people space, give people air, give people light, give people that privacy as well. All things which we kind of take for granted.
Very much. And I guess also, rather than the sprawling slum area, we were starting to build skyward, weren't we? So this sort of vertical living. So this is why I think walking through Churchill Gardens, this beautiful architecture by Powell and Moyer, I mean, what would we see? What were they doing that made this place? Because it's still there now, Churchill Gardens. We can walk through and it's still after all these years. So how did they differ with the housing, with what they did for this project?
They brought continental ideas of housing, the ideas of Corbusier, which is the idea of the housing block within the landscape into the city centres. It differed from Unité d'Habitation in Marseille in that was a single block in the landscape. This was multiple blocks. And it contrasts greatly with the housing that was there. So Pimlico is an area of terrace rows of houses, typically stuccoed houses from the Victorian period. There is it's a later sort of development of Dolphin Square nearby to Churchill Gardens, which was pre-war and was a development of a sort of large mansion block around a courtyard. So, but again, still quite different to Churchill Gardens. Yeah. Churchill Gardens brought these ideas of the building set into landscape, allowing people space and views within the heart of London. I think if you keep in mind at the time, high density housing was still needed. They couldn't take the sort of low density ideas of suburban dwellings. They needed high density because there was still industry in the centre of London. There was industry on the sides of the Thames. So going across the Thames was the power station, and there would have been another industry around that area as well. Because so there was a need for workers.
There was a need, absolutely, because we know that a lot of people moved out into the new towns that were being built. So there was a migration there. But like you say, people needed to still be in London. They needed that area to sort of live in and not have to travel far. And it's interesting, actually. I'm in your offices here at Lilley Architects, and you've actually very kindly got up on the screen an aerial view of Churchill Gardens. And for me, as an artist, I find the visual is brilliant. I mean, I've walked through it myself, but now to see it from an aerial view. So we're looking at, I mean, they actually placed the blocks quite sympathetically as well. There was so much new. We've got to remember when this was being built, haven't we? I mean, it was so modern for its time. So what were the blocks like? I mean, were they really tall? Or is it what were we talking about?
The blocks varied in size. So there was some low-rise blocks of 3 or 4 stories in sort of a kind of sinuous form. Then you've got these a number of high-rise blocks going up to 11 stories. Some of them quite long, but alternating and sort of set apart. So they're not in rigid rows or along rigid axis. They're very much taking up
it's softer,
the views
isn't it?
of the Thames. So they're slightly angled to the Thames to get best views. And the road running through the estate is slightly curved as well, so it sort of softens it. This idea they had of sort of a humanised modernism, so not the sort of rigid, all concrete ideas.
Like grid, not too, because to me it's not such a grid. It's actually broken up, isn't it? It is a softer when you look from that aerial view.
Yeah, the houses have quite large balconies. There's a lot of brickwork still involved in in the construction of
Yes.
them, so that it sort of softens the appearance of it. And also along Lupus Street, they keep a street frontage. So there's a row of houses over shops as well, so that they're in a way they're connecting with the existing street pattern.
And this I guess this idea of social amenity, because the scheme included other things, didn't it? Like I think I was reading a school or something, or a playgroup, or
it does. And I think this comes from the size of the estate. It's I think at the time it was the largest estate designed by a single architect or a single practice.
Yeah.
I think it's 200 acres.
Wow.
So very, very large.
How long would that have taken to build? You know, I mean, was that pretty quick to because I know there was this need, wasn't it? I mean, obviously there's the idea of the prefab houses, which I'd love to chat to you about, but I don't think we're going to have time. But I love all the idea of these components, and obviously this is what goes into these high rise as well. So everybody was given a decent sized space, but were these built pretty quickly as well? They
would have been built quicker than we would have been used to in terms of traditional buildings, or in terms of terrace building and suburban building, which are essentially brick built.
Okay, so it was
hand.
Materials helped it.
So here we're talking about the use of concrete frames to speed up. So there's much more sort of mechanization, industrialization in the construction of them. You know, repetition making it, making that process quicker as well.
Yes.
So they would have been put up relatively quickly.
So would they have been like a prefab built off site and brought in, or would they have built them on site? I mean,
these would more likely have been built on site, but using much greater mechanization in their building.
So was concrete quite a new material for housing? Was that quite a new?
Not in terms of the technology. I think the technology was there in terms of the modernist traditions had sort of developed concrete in housing. In South London, near the Horniman, is the very first concrete house, and it's a Victorian house, and it looks in a Gothic style, but it's built entirely of concrete. So there is a tradition of concrete use for housing going back.
There's a history there.
But by this time, they're taking advances which probably there were through the war in terms of concrete construction and the materials science of taking those and applying them to housing, or sort of mass housing.
As people would have had before, in high density, there'd still be this sense of community. So you're not being ripped apart from that in a way. There's still that.
There would have been a strong community there beforehand, and clearly, given the size of the estate, there's probably an intention to keep a lot of that community in place. And of course, the authorities were taking on the public need for other facilities. So as well as houses, you've got schools,
healthcare. Okay, yes.
And shops and facilities of that. And I think it comes out of this tradition of the period where the government is taking on more of these responsibilities rather than leaving them to sort of private landlords to provide.
Yes, and I think something for us not to forget in history, actually, how this, the fact that we do take it for granted, and actually these were very modern for their time and very, very new. Thank you so much for talking to me, Jonathan. It's so fascinating, because it's part of our social history, isn't it? It's the fabric of how we live and how things have moved forward.
Thank you.
End of part 1. Thanks to the Arts Council England for grant funding to enable this podcast, and Jonathan Goode of Lilley Architects. Sound edit and production, Paul Windridge. Artist Lisa Traxler at lisatraxler.com.